So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Enno Maessen. I'm delighted to welcome him to give this evening's talk. A little background on him. Enno Maessen is a lecturer in history at Utrecht University, and his research interests cover the fields of urban history, modern Turkey, the Eastern Mediterranean region, social movements, and the politics of representation in the second half of the 20th century. He's published in several publications: Patterns of Prejudice, Middle Eastern Studies, the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, and so on. And last year, he published a book on which he will draw this evening, Representing Modern Istanbul, published by IB Tauris. And apart from his academic writing, he publishes in various news outlets. And it's also worth noting that Dr. Maessen is a co-founder of the Turkish Studies Network in the Low Countries. And we have been fortunate in recent years to have other speakers from that network. Ozan Zavji, Hüseyin Alul, are both given Zoom talks in the last 2 years. And it's an independent, multidisciplinary, multi-country network where researchers interested in the study of Turkish matters share their thoughts and research. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing and invite Dr. Enno Maessen to talk to us about urban life in 20th century Beyoğlu.
Thank you very much, Quentin, for this kind introduction. Let me also share my screen. Yeah, then we've all. I think you also already said I need to unmute myself. I said that I need to share my screen now. Then we both had the most popular COVID quotes. I think already covered. Thank you all very much for being here, and a special thanks, of course, to the Levantine Heritage Foundation for generously inviting me to present my recent book and the work related to that. For the coming 45 minutes, I will introduce you to my work that I discussed extensively in my recent book that Quentin already introduced, Representing Modern Istanbul, Urban History and International Institutions in 20th Century Beyoğlu, which was first published just a little under a year ago, and will also be available in paperback format as of this summer, which is significant because that also means that the price will significantly drop. If you're based in Turkey and prefer to read it in Turkish, there will also be a Turkish translation available later this year. Now, on the book, I think that the subtitle explains that the book is principally about Beyoğlu rather than Istanbul, the metropolitan area. Yet, since this is a cultural history of Beyoğlu and Istanbul, it is important to note, as you will probably know from your own experience, that what is represented as historical Istanbul in various ways often converges or is conflated with what's actually Beyoğlu, meaning that Beyoğlu is in many ways what we like to call overdetermined as Istanbul. In similar ways, actually, that another Istanbul, or imagining of Istanbul, is often overdetermined historical peninsula. Nowadays, as many of you will be well aware, we see Beyoğlu as a hotbed for tourism, for real estate speculation, for gentrification, and in which the historical landscape and also local communities are and have been subjugated to the impulses of capitalism. As you will probably be aware, Beyoğlu is a space of many places, and it is inscribed with different meanings by different communities and in different temporalities. I'm sure that many in the audience will have actually also their own imaginings of Beyoğlu and their own memories of Beyoğlu. Yet, as I hope to explain in a bit, there are also strong commonalities between different representations of Beyoğlu, historically and culturally speaking. Now, one common trope that we frequently see, for instance, in accounts on Beyoğlu between the 18th and the 20th century, whether it's travelers or residents, foreign and local alike, is that this is such a fascinating place to be. And up to this date, you will probably be familiar with a version of this story that I'm about to sort of re-narrate to you. So how often elderly men, or sometimes also women, will recount how fancy a place Beyoğlu was until the 1960s, and how you could not go there without a tie, without a hat, without a crease in your trousers. And of course, that the times have very much changed for the worse. On the other hand, it has also been presented as a place not to be. So nightclubs, brothels, public drinking, dancing, gambling, and the general lack of morale and cleanliness were equally popular ways to represent and imagine Beyoğlu. Now, Cemil Çik, a colleague of mine that also many of you will know, has quoted a writer by the name of Mustafa Remzi, and he recounts the arrival of jazz to Istanbul and Beyoğlu in the 1920s in his book called Öldüren Dans, so the dance that kills. And in it, Remzi states, "Dancing amidst the jumping and maddening noise of the jazz band is certain to turn a young girl into a prostitute and a man into a murderer, a madman, or at the very least, an imbecile." As you can see over here, an image with jazz and dancing from the 1920s. It was really debauchery in its purest form. Sorry. Now, I would like to take a step back from Beyoğlu and talk to you a little bit about a concept, if you will, or a theory. Don't worry, I won't go on about that very extensively, but I do think, like it is instructive. There is a Dutch scholar, Joep Leersen, and he has shown in the case of national stereotypes that for each positive stereotype about a nation, a negative stereotype can be found, rendering its value in interpreting communities of quite little use. And here you can see an example from the 19th century's German Völkertafel, which shows the defining characteristics of the people of Europe through a quote-unquote German perspective. And he displays massive stereotypical divergences between North and South, and also between East and West. So we see that the Germans are frank, their nature is very good, they are hardworking, and they will die of drinking wine. The French are frivolous, they are friendly and talkative, and they will die in war. The Greeks, Turks, note that this is one category over here, are, and I quote here, they are like the weather in April. Their national character is treacherous, their country is picturesque, and they will die through deceit. Now, although these stereotypes are obviously racist, orientalist, sexist, these and other stereotypes do inform us about how communities like to represent themselves and how they are represented from the outside. And I argue that the same holds true for communities and spaces at the local level. For instance, in the case of Beyoğlu. Beyoğlu, the cosmopolitan utopia, Beyoğlu, Istanbul, Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, these stereotypes are in the case of Beyoğlu particularly important because they will have and would have a strong impact on the ways in which the area is represented up to this day. The stereotypes resonate also in urban nostalgia on Beyoğlu or Istanbul and in Turkey, particularly since the 1980s. And partly due to that, they featured in a wide array of studies that discuss 19th and early 20th century Istanbul. Now, the 1980s, some of you may have actually experienced this, witnessed an explosion of fiction and popular histories of the area around the late 19th century, which has witnessed also very recent incarnations. As you are well aware, everything of significance nowadays needs to have a Netflix or a Disney show these days. And so why not Beyoğlu, of course? You possibly saw the banners of this particular one. So let me make some additional advertisements for that over here. The most recent incarnation of representation on Beyoğlu on the screen is a somewhat kitschy Netflix show, which is called Pera Palasa Gece Yarısı, or A Midnight at Pera Palace. So obviously, sort of, like in reference to the book by King about the famous Pera Palace Hotel, in which a journalist time travels to the hotel's heydays, supposedly the early 1900s. Many of you will probably also know or have even watched another variant that engages with episodes of Beyoğlu's recent history, Kulüp. And this gives an interesting twist on the vibrant nightlife of Beyoğlu, as well as the pogroms against non-Muslim community took place in 1955. Now, to go on a little bit further to a different time layer, that also shows us another example of stereotypes on Beyoğlu, is in cinematic depictions of Istanbul, of Beyoğlu, and of Turkish society. And we see, for instance, that Beyoğlu in the 1960s and 1970s, also arguably before that, was a main center of cinema production through the Yeşilçam cinema industry, which produced approximately 300 films annually at its height in the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. And for the actors playing these films, having jobs in the nightlife of Beyoğlu was quite common. And an article from November 1972 in the Millia Daily discusses how, following the opening of the new nightclub or casino season, an ever larger amount of names of Yeşilçam stars was also featuring in the neon lights of the casinos. Now, film producers actually preferred hiring girls who had no experience in the nightlife sectors. And in an article from a cinema magazine, which is called Perde ve Sahne, referencing here to Mutlu's thesis, we see that filmmakers lament about their difficulties in finding female actresses. And they indicate that the profession had a bad image because of the large number of pub women, bar kadını, and ballet dancers working as actresses. Now, an announcement in Perde ve Sahne from 1954 explicitly asked for the following: a family girl type of lady of 165 tall, with a symmetrical body, pretty face, sufficiently acculturated between the age of 22 and 26, with no working experiences in places like public nightclubs or bars. And those nightclubs and bars were at the time very much in Beyoğlu. So we see over here that there is a negative representation, you could argue, of Beyoğlu and Beyoğlu's representation, which also intersects with conceptions of femininity, chastity, womanhood, and girlhood in Turkish society. A recurring stereotype that connects to that about Beyoğlu as a place of moral deprivation is also often reproduced in Yeşilçam, and which is somehow more contrasted with the more positive and recurring stereotype of Beyoğlu as the place to be in Istanbul and Turkey. In these Yeşilçam films, we find a poor and honest environment of the countryside, which is often the cradle of a protagonist, and another place, which is then Beyoğlu, which is quite often represented as the cradle of evil, the home to the degenerate and slippery values, a trap for innocent country boys and naive young women without male protection. And you see that these stereotypes of the pub woman on the one hand and Beyoğlu as a place of moral deprivations are also brought together in sort of a meta-irony in this film that you see the sort of poster of over here in the slide, which is called Beyoğlu Güzeli, which is a film by Ertem Eğilmez, in which rich kid Ferit, which is played by Tarık Akan, falls in love with the Beyoğlu Güzeli, which is a singer and by the name of Alef, which is played by Hülya Koçyiğit. And Alef, played by Koçyiğit, is accused here by Ferit's father of being a bar kadını and, as such, a morally deprived woman. Now, so here we have sort of a very quick intersection of a few stereotypes on Beyoğlu. To come back to my book, I was mostly interested in a period between 1950s and 1980s approximately. And this is a period that is still quite often neglected in urban history generally. And if it is addressed, it is mostly from a perspective of urban planning. Also, we see this in the case of Istanbul, especially up to the history of the, say, 1950s. We see a plethora of works that discuss, for instance, the urban reforms of Henry Prost, the micromanagement of Adnan Menderes in the city, and so on and so forth. But very little actually work is being done post 1950s, and more specifically also on the cultural and social history of Istanbul and Beyoğlu in particular. That is actually quite remarkable, since these 30 to 40 years are of fundamental significance for Istanbul, since it would grow out from a diverse but mid-sized city to a regional metropole with, again, very different, or still very diverse, but a very different demographic diversity. Now, despite of the efforts of the Turkish state to homogenize the country from the 1930s onwards, the multicultural makeup of the district and its significance in the city, so of Beyoğlu, would largely remain until the 1960s and 1970s. So often when Beyoğlu is imagined, we have the idea that sort of its heyday ended somewhere after the Second World War. When we look at statistics, when we look at narrations of or memoirs on the district, we do actually see that from a cultural, social, economic, and also to a significant degree, as I hope to explain in my lecture, a political perspective, the significance of Beyoğlu would actually sustain at least until the 1970s. Now, although many residents had left or were forced to leave the district by the 1970s and 1980s, Beyoğlu would remain an important hub of multiculturalism through its institutions. And by institutions, I mean especially clubs, schools, businesses, and other places of formal and informal gathering. It was therefore that I decided in the book and in my research project to focus on 5 institutions that are not necessarily representative. So I do not aim, or have not aimed in this book, to write the history of Beyoğlu. As you will probably agree, that is impossible. But I have focused on 5 institutions that tell some stories that are somehow symptomatic for some of the grander developments in Beyoğlu in the second half of the 20th century. And that connect to some of the continuities and also discontinuities in the district. Now, within the district of Beyoğlu, I've studied 2 clubs and 3 schools. You can see them here in the map of Beyoğlu. And in part, I have to say this was a practical choice because I needed archives and informants to work with. Yet I also expected that the continued presence of these institutions would shed some light on the problematic ways in which Beyoğlu's demise after the 1950s was represented. Even after selecting these cases, which are at the very bottom, Teutonia, so that's the smallest red bit on the map. Right above it is the German high school, Alman Lisesi. Then a little bit further above that, we have the English high school for girls. Then we have the Grand Lodge of accepted and free, Grand Lodge of Free and Accepted Masons. Then we have, which is not a part of the book in the end, actually. We have the Galatasaray High School, and then last but not least, we have the Cercle d'Orient, so the Gentlemen's Club, and also, as some of you will know, that parcel is also very much connected to the cinematic history of Beyoğlu through MX Cinema and other institutions that were based there. Now, these cases did provide, like some solid entry points into the history of Beyoğlu, but still it was difficult to get hold of material, and you could say that various people were not keen on giving access to sources. Some of the common excuses that I heard were, a book has already been written about us and you can read that. Or one that was also quite recurrent is, and the historians among you will recognize this sort of excuse, we have no archives. And I also heard this in the case of the German high school, and you maybe can feel the irony here. Another one, which was quite common, is we do not allow anyone in our archives. Fair enough, but I mean, especially like for older institutions, then one might also wonder what the purpose of the archive actually is, if we do not allow historians to work with them. Now, the case of two foreign schools, which was the English high school for girls and the German high school, showed me how the presence of these institutions in Beyoğlu, because despite of this representation of a demise, was very much enduring, but also a process that was partially enforced. And that is actually one of the most interesting parts, where we see local, national, and international or transnational histories intersect. Both schools, so the German high school and the English high school for girls, were severely obstructed by the Turkish state in developing plans to move their buildings elsewhere with easier access or sort of a better growth potential. And I will come back to that later on. In both cases, we also see, so in both schools, we also see that the original purpose of the schools, which up until roughly the 1950s had been to educate children from the homelands, had been diminished by the 1950s. And after that, most of the students were basically local citizens. Nonetheless, there were significant efforts of both the British and German governments to keep these expensive schools open. Expensive, meaning they actually took a lot of cash from from the treasury of Western Germany and the United Kingdom. Now, the only way I think we can consider that is in the light of cultural diplomacy, and I will come back to that in a bit. These countries want to maintain good relations with Turkey through the schools and by training a future Anglophone or Germanophone elite. And as such, as I already hinted at a couple of minutes before, we see a sort of intersection of international geopolitics and bilateral relations, so international history and local history, because these currents would have a direct effect on the preservation of some of Beyoğlu's core functions, which one historically was a very important core function of the district, was actually education. Now, to give you an insight in the function and the popularity of these schools, here we can see a class picture from the 1970s of the German high school. Sorry, I will share a few examples with you. So in one account that I found from 1906, an official at the German embassy in Ankara mentions the significance of continuing the school since, the quote in German, immer deutlicher ergibt sich von Jahr zu Jahr, dass die kulturelle Arbeit in der Türkei sich wirklich lohnt. So it becomes clear, ever clearer from year to year, that the cultural works in Turkey are really paying off. And referring to the greater efforts that were made by the French and Americans in 1965, he recommends Turkey to be ranked on the foreign ministry's priority, particularly considering the aufrichtigen Freundschaft der Türken, so the sincere friendship of the Turks. And that also sort of the popular school also is shown in its numbers. So in 1968, there were 1,343 applicants registered for only 90 prep positions in the prep classes. And those numbers had risen to 3,415 in 1977. So these are really whopping numbers, especially also if you consider that the German high school, was an institution that will also, became imbued with the legacy of Nazism in the 1940s, but quite quickly recovered from that from the 1950s onwards. As many of you will know, the school nowadays is still considered to be an important effort or an important institution in Beyoğlu, but also an important effort in cultural diplomacy by the German Republic, and has been in Beyoğlu continuously since its foundation in the late 19th century. Now, let me move to the next slide. Yes. The quickly rising numbers between the 1950s and 1970s of students and also applications, because the Germans also noted that their school was so popular, and they were aware that they could sort of like increase like the impact of their cultural work, if you like, by looking for a more convenient school building. And the Germans also, when visiting the building in Tunal, were actually questioning whether it was suitable for education of such a large student population. Now, the school's management's plans to counter some of the structural challenges included the options to move the building away from its old location. Now, when these plans were discussed, and we see similar developments actually also in the case of French schools, and as I will show later in the case of the English high school for girls, the Turkish authorities actually made that very difficult, because they sort of took a very strict interpretation of the Lausanne Agreement to obstruct the building of quote-unquote new foreign schools. So the Lausanne Agreement stipulated that the status quo of any foreign institution present in the Ottoman Empire would be sustained, but that no new ones could be opened. So that also meant, in the interpretation of the Turkish state, if the institution would move to a different parcel or a different neighborhood, sort of a new institution would have to be erected. And why the Germans and the English and others were so keen on avoiding that is that amendments would also usually entail a transition of the institution's status, and in the case of foreign schools, of their curricular independence. So they would become less German schools or English schools and more Turkish state schools. So they see that also reflected in the promise of, like, sustaining educational and other institutions. We see also reflected in İsmet İnönü communiques, which were sort of addendums to the Lausanne treatment, or treaty. Yes. Next slide. Now, although moving seemed to be the most desirable option for the German school for the sake of growth potential, the Germans also expected that it would mean losing a great deal of its independence. It would mean that a fully Turkish management would take over the school. And these were concerns which would have not been an issue if the school decided to stay in the old building. A different option, therefore, was to expand and renovate the present building, which to some degree also happened. A limited expansion would occur, but it did stay in order not to lose the curricular independence in the old building at Tunal. And we can ask ourselves the question why the German school was hesitant to consider a new status in the Turkish educational system. And the answer lies most probably in the way that German authorities considered these and other German schools. Again, as I already mentioned, as instruments of diplomacy. Through education in German, based on German models of instruction, you have an opportunity, obviously, to educate a part of a local intelligentsia and promote sympathy for German culture and positive Turkish-German ties. And I therefore argue that the enduring presence of the German school can be interplayed as, again, that interplay of geopolitics. On the one hand, we see the Turkish Republic's desire to hold quite rigidly onto the stipulations of the Lausanne Agreement, and we see the German representatives in Turkey and Germany's desire to maintain this institution as independent from the Turkish educational system as possible and facilitating for a more robust instrument of cultural diplomacy. And more important for this present discussion, it is meant that Beyoğlu would hold on to one of its most prestigious institutions of education and sustain a very visible and significant representative of its core function as a place of social gathering and education. We also see that here in a cable, in a diplomatic cable to the or from the General Consulate General of the German Republic. We see here die Schule, das Kernstück unserer kultisches Bemühungen in der Türkei, darf nicht verkümmern, sondern sollte es organisch in dem von Anfang an abgesteckten Rahmen weiter wachsen können. So the zest of it is basically, so the school, which is significantly the most important part of our, like cultural, political, interference or efforts in Turkey, should not sort of decay. It should, be allowed the potential to blossom. Now, the same applies for another long-standing educational institutions, which were the English High School for Girls at İstiklal Caddesi and its sister school or brother school of the boys in Nişantaşı, pardon. And Angus Gillen, who was a representative of the British Council in London, wrote the following in 1946 on this school. On general principle, I feel strongly that an efficient British school which is open to and really used by the natives is in any country the very best propaganda we can do and should have a very high priority. The amount, and we see that also here in the excerpt on the slide, referring, it starts in the second paragraph. It appears that the girls' high school is also an important item next to the boys' school of British influence in Turkey. Although few Turkish girls from the school enter professions, the influence of those who settle down to married life is not lost, and their knowledge of the English language and their interest in the British method of education has a value. Now that the women of Turkey have been to a great extent freed from the restrictions which the Muslim religion and Turkish custom impose, they are beginning to exert an influence on the life and development of their country, whose future does to a considerable extent depend on the part played by its women. It is noteworthy that in general the pupils at the girls' school come from a higher social stratum than those at the boys' school. Now you can see that some of the conceptions of womanhood and are very gendered and rather dated in this excerpt, and also to some degree they are false, because some of the interviews that I took with some of the girls, graduates, and also former teachers at the school actually discussed that many of the girls also in these years, so 50s, 60s, 70s, would actually have very successful careers. So contrary to the suggestion that is made in this excerpt. Now, we see a similar picture in this English high school of girls as we see in the German school. So the amount of non-British students in both the girls' schools and the rated boys' schools in Nişantaşı was estimated to be 75%, with very long waiting lists, again similar to the prep classes of the German high school. And this also might, I might suggest, gives a clue of the impact that this school had on the local population, particularly considering that many of the school's graduates would be able to attain established career, or at the very least would be able to operate in the higher social strata of Turkish society. Now, the importance of this observation can also be appreciated, I think, in the light of Iron Curtains that were being drawn up. As Turkey was aligning it in the sort of post-Second World War with the Western Bloc, and actually actively persuaded to do so by Great Britain and the United States, the words of a man like Gillen from the British Council should not just be understood in local, national, or bilateral context, but also very much in the world of shifting geopolitics. Great Britain feared the possibility of growing influence of the Soviet Union in Greece and Turkey, and with the aggressive rise of a communist party in Greece, the British government feared, for instance, that Greece's sympathies could shift towards the Soviets, and that would have a detrimental effect on the position of the United Kingdom, but also of the United States in the region. Now, in the post-World War climate, the British were no longer able to, exert as much imperial power as they would have been able to do up until the 1940s. So they also resorted considerably more to cultural diplomacy, like in the case of these schools. And when issues of finance and the necessity for a transfer of or adjustments of the school's legal status become more pressing in the 1960s, we also see an example of this, because it is pointed out in a memorandum of the British Council that the schools committees opposed the transfer of the schools to the Turkish state, as the Turkish educational system would inevitably result in the schools losing their special nature as quote-unquote English schools. So the documents also indicate that this special nature does refer not only to the language of instruction, but also to the entire character of the school. And that is also something that I have seen quite often in interviews with some of the graduates and teachers who've sort of, represented the English high school for girls as an English school that was more English than its counterparts in the UK. You could say that when we reflect on the discourse of a post-imperial Britain, which was struggling to find its position in the world, it is suggested that the appeal of the schools was generated by its deviation from the Turkish educational systems along what some people, diplomats and educators, would call liberal English lines, and that students or pupils at the school would develop a personal and intellectual discipline that is not found elsewhere in Turkey. So there is also, apart from the idea that one has to invest for cultural diplomatic purposes, there's also a very strong conviction in the supremacy of English education, British education, as opposed to Turkish education. Now, the Foreign Office and the British Council were actively engaged in what scholars like Sarah Davies have described as the struggle for men's minds. Considering the efforts that were deployed in Turkey and other countries, the British initiatives at the onset of the Cold War did, however, seem to have lacked a very clear strategy. So the British Council schools in the Middle East, for instance, were often considered to be the most important branch of British cultural diplomacy. But as a quote from one of the British Council staff members goes, their character-building reputation lent them a level of prestige which enabled them to attract the children of important families and to build up understanding of Britain, both by their impact upon the pupils and by their contact with the parents. But still, the impact is often underestimated, as some scholars have suggested. So cultural diplomacy in the Middle East somehow failed because it set rather unrealistic targets. So cultural diplomacy typically takes a lot of time to bear fruit, whereas the impact of political and economic diplomacy can have quick and drastic or even very dramatic effects. Yet also, and I would like to conclude with my rather lengthy discussion of geopolitics here, we also see in the case of the English High School for Girls that Beyoğlu again remained a home to educational institutions and a center stage, if you like, of geopolitics in the Cold War era. I will leave the geopolitics behind now and turn to another interesting but very different example, which is the Galatasaray High School. For this case study, I mostly work with memoirs from the alumni of this Francophone high school, which throughout the generations cultivate a very strong connection with Beyoğlu. The graduates of this high school felt that their personal memories were very strongly connected to the place that is Galatasaray and Beyoğlu. For all of these alumni, the Galatasaray building and quote-unquote their Beyoğlu remains the setting and point of reference for their childhood and adolescent memories. And they found that the imagining of Galatasaray as an island of sorts in Beyoğlu is a recurrent mode of imagining of the alumni. And a notable spatial point of reference from that perspective is one that I think you will very likely be familiar with, which are the fences surrounding the school's premises directly facing Istiklal Caddesi, which you can see over here at the front of this picture. The gates and fences separated the school from what happened around its premises, and that is a theme that is frequently employed in the stories of placemaking of the students throughout the years and throughout memories. So both in a metaphoric and a literal spatial sense, it separated Galatasaray and the pupils from Beyoğlu, being part and parcel of it and distinctively separate from it simultaneously. Accounts of the alumni in which Beyoğlu and the school's building and fences feature as a point of reference and setting for the memories of the boys, and from 1965 onwards also girls, indicate what strong an imprint the building site left on the students of Galatasaray. The girls who reached the high school level, in fact, initially stayed at the building in Ortaköy, but gradually started to be admitted to the Beyoğlu building as well. And again, also here stressing Galatasaray's connection with Beyoğlu, one author states that this was very significant, so the attendance of girls also in Beyoğlu, because, and I quote here, to be a true Galatasaraylı, one needs to study in Beyoğlu. So to be a true Galatasaraylı, one needs to study in Beyoğlu. For the alumni, the Galatasaray building and their Beyoğlu is, like frequently represented as, like this anchor point, you could argue. Now, as much, you can also see an example of that over here, in which the again the fence takes center stage. Now, as much as pupils, alumni cherish the memories from their days at the high school, I also found that the students of Galatasaray reflected some of the shifting attitudes towards multiculturalism that existed within the framework of Turkish nationalism. Whereas some felt the need to stress that they were not racists or cherished memories regarding their quote-unquote Turkified Armenian teachers, some of the more older graduates felt instilled with pride when they recounted memories or stories of attacks against Rum Istanbulite citizens. And particularly in the early decades of the school as a Turkish high school, we can definitely see that Turkish ethno-nationalism also seeped through the fences of the school. And I think that the comments of one Galatasaray alumnus highlights this as follows. So the original quote in Turkish is on the slide. I will read it out in English. I think that Galatasaray in the Beyoğlu neighborhood, which was the last to Turkify, was not just a hearth of knowledge, where the most important and bravest sons of the nations were educated. At the same time, it was a sacred place where the masses who spoke with a variety of languages past the iron fences were obliged to lower their voices. Yes, a sacred place. Even on the darkest days and the worst moments, the children of the motherland were worshipping Turkishness there without losing any of the spirit and fire in their hearts. Now, what we can read in these statements is that on the one hand, Galatasaray was part of Beyoğlu, but also very notably different from it. And such a diversity in attitudes also makes the school, you could argue, a telling microcosm of more general tropes and representations of Beyoğlu, ranging from, on the one hand, multiculturalist nostalgia, to, on the other, xenophobia. Right. Okay. I will move now to my last case study that I will discuss, which again tells a very different story about Beyoğlu, one that I already briefly referred to at the beginning when I talked about the cinematic history and the representations of Beyoğlu in cinema, and that is the another building that many of you will know in many incarnations, and that is the Cercle d'Orient, or the Büyük Kulüp, which was a elite gentlemen's club. It still exists. It moved to a köşk on the Asian shore, close to Bağdat Caddesi, where it has quite like extensive premises. But previously, they also were renting a building in Beyoğlu, or the Cercle d'Orient building, which is also still the namesake of the building, though nowadays I believe it's also referred to Grand Pera after its contested renovation. Now, around the building of this elite gentlemen's club, this vibrant cinema production culture of Yeşilçam that I already mentioned towards the beginning of my talk started to rise from the 1950s onwards. So close to 400 films per year were produced around this parcel per year, with anything ranging from so-called kebab westerns to Turkified versions of Star Trek, so pornography, comedies, and local dramas with heavy involvement of local pop stars a la Elvis Presley, here with Orhan Gencebay and Ibrahim Tatlıses. Now, this cinema production, you could argue, nurtured the cultural or escapist appetite of young families, of women and men, which, of course, up to this day is very much a significant part of social and cultural memory in Turkey. And you could argue, therefore, also that Beyoğlu is a hotbed for a lasting memory and heritage of cinema. But as a consequence of the destruction and fabrication that I will discuss now, this legacy of cinema is actually, unfortunately, hardly anywhere to be found nowadays in Beyoğlu. Now, as I already mentioned, some of you may have intimate familiarity with the history of this building as users, as researchers, or maybe as activists. But I hope that, for the more general audience, I hope you will bear with me. Now, the Circulaire building itself has been listed as a first-grade historical building since the 1970s, which does not allow for any changes to be made to the building's interior and exterior. And although its current usage has been entirely subjected to investment patterns of capitalism, global capitalism, the building has actually been restored with remarkable detail. I visited in 2016, and compared to many of the contestable restorations that have been done and are being executed in Beyoğlu, this building, so the front part of the parcel, which is the Circulaire, has been restored quite well. Also remarkable, considering the fact that all of the surrounding buildings have been entirely destroyed. And I have to emphasize here that these buildings were also listed, though in a different category. So the Emek Cinema, which you may know or have visited, also perhaps as a film viewer, were listed as a second-grade historical building, which theoretically should have made it impossible to make any changes to the building's exterior, which obviously did not happen. It was entirely destroyed. Now, new legislation that was introduced in 2005, the law on the protection of deteriorated historic and cultural heritage through renewal and reuse, also often referred to by its number 5366, made this possible, had this extensive destruction of this architectural heritage. And I would like to reflect a little bit on the history and contested sort of heritage imagining of these buildings. So I will focus a little less here on the club that is associated to the building and a little more to some of the more multi-purpose value of the parcel and the building. Because I think that the rather fierce debates on these buildings in recent times actually have diverted some attention from the fact that the purpose of the building has been subject to discussions since at least the 1950s. So in a news message from 1 December 1951, for instance, we see that read in the Cumhuriyet that the municipality, so the Istanbul municipality, had decided to sell the building that it had acquired during the quote-unquote war years for 1 million liras. In a publication, the municipality, which you can see over here, which was titled Güzel Istanbul, so Beautifying Istanbul, it is stated that all of the Circulaire buildings were bought for a total amount of 1.1 million Turkish liras, and that the total plot of land comprised 410,350 square meters, consisting of 3 adjacent plots with buildings that accommodated a diverse combination of residential and commercial purposes. Though I have not been able to find conclusive evidence for this yet, it seems plausible that the municipality actually acquired or confiscated the block from the previous owners due to the 1942 wealth tax, so the Waarlijk Variatie campaign. As some of you may know, the building was actually, so the Cercle d'Orient building was actually commissioned by a famous Istanbulite of the late 19th century, Abraham Pasha or Ibrahim Pasha, who later on had to sort of let go of it because of his extensive debt record. But then it transferred hands to some of the non-Muslim communities, and probably it was disappropriated in the 1940s. After this appropriation by the municipality and then subsequent sell-off, a new or episode of contested usage begins. Because after acquiring the block, the municipality had unsuccessfully tried to evict the tenants from the building. And in 1957, the building block was finally sold off to the pension fund, so the Maessen, which was the only participant in the public bidding, and they bought it from the municipality for 16.5 million liras, despite of the municipality's aim to sell it at least for 25 million. Now, the Maessen decided then that the cinema, or the main cinema hall that was present in the building until that time, the Melek Sineması, should be known from then onwards as the Emek Sineması, which then became, like part of many an Istanbul lights cultural and personal social memory. Now, from the late 1960s onwards, this building, of which you can see the interior hall over here, was used for film screenings during daytime and operettas, musicals, variety and theaters, and concerts of foreign artists in the evening. And it can really be sort of ensured that the Cercle d'Orient parcel became a center of sorts for cultural life in Beyoğlu and in Istanbul, beyond sort of this cinema productions industry of Yeşilçam. Apart from these sort of daytime operettas, musicals, variety theaters, and concert, Emek Sineması was also very much a cinema, and for that purpose also screened a very diverse program and participated in many film festivals together with the new Atatürk Cultural Center. And the Cercle d'Orient building, which you can see on the left, actually witnessed a very different trajectory. A major fire had made parts of the floor that were used by the Buurtclub, so by the club, practically unusable. And in an article in Cumhuriyet from 1983, we see that actually most of this building, or at least its top floors, had become a storage facility for a clothing brand. The second floors, or sort of the first floors, were squatted partly, while the ground floors were used by many shops, including the legendary İnci Patisserie, but also by smaller cinemas like Rüya Sineması. Now, from the perspective of the preservation and restoration, the archives of the Chamber of Architects show that as early as 1971, as I already indicated earlier, the Council for Historical Real Estate and Monuments demanded that practically all buildings on both sides of the axis between Tünel and Taksim, so around Istiklal Caddesi, would be subject to protection and therefore conservation. A halt was thus made to any prospective changes, and the ultimate purpose of the council was to pave the way for reinvigorating the Beyoğlu area and turn it into an area for tourism. Now, the reality was rather that municipalities started destroying historical properties illegally. And Attila Dorsey commented on this, stating that, similar to nowadays, in fact, the tendency was to open shopping passages and close cultural institutions in Beyoğlu at that period of time. And this would also start to have a notable effect on the Cercle d'Orient parcel, when the pension fund, so the Emek Sandığı, decided in 1993, so I'm jumping a little bit forward in time. In 1993, they decided to grant a concession for 25 years to a businessman named Kamer Tosun and his construction firm Kamer İnşaat. Now, soon after this, a group that feared closure of the cinema started a petition titled "Let's Emek Sineması Exist," Emek Sineması Yaşatılsın, which would be signed by thousands. Now, one of Kamer İnşaat's owners, Veysel Tosun, stated around that time that there are 6 architects taking measurements in the building. And after this, we'll apply to the Council for Monuments and bring the project into operation. Everyone is going to thank us when this project is finished. We are going to change Beyoğlu's appearance. Of course, we are making profit from this project. No one can execute a project like this for nothing, but we will definitely not touch the historical construction. The plans at the time, however, indicate that the building and the parcel would be drastically reconstructed and would severely damage the historical properties. And I think that the recent history, as I have tried to sketch it over here, gives insight into successive layers of Istanbul's debate on public space. More than anything, this parcel, this building shows on a micro level how the city has been first subjected to government policies inspired by Turkish nationalism and later affected by increasing exposure to economic liberalization. But the successive transfer of ownership in the case of the Cercle d'Orient building also shows is that in all cases, little to no attention was attributed to the judicial and arguably moral rights and needs of tenants and users of the buildings. So, as you may remember, the famous İnci Pastanesi was the owners were basically forced to close down and vacate their well, not properties, but their vacate the building. Now, the case of the Cercle d'Orient also shows us that the municipality, both due to its reluctance to act until at least the 1990s, as well as its eagerness to act after 2005, has historically had little interest in making efforts to preserve a unique and irreplaceable part of human heritage of Beyoğlu's and Istanbul heritage. And as much as we can attribute a part of this to more recent administrators and legislation, it is also very much a long-term pattern, as we have seen looking back to the 1950s. It was firstly driven by ethno-nationalists and later by neoliberal dynamics. In any case, I think it has led to a situation in which significant parts of Beyoğlu's tangible heritage, not to mention its intangible heritage, think of the film heritage of Yeşilçam and how it lives on in the cultural heritage of many citizens of Turkey, is really left to the grace of speculative value. Now, if you were interested in reading my book, you will also see that I try to further underscore the importance of studying recent urban history to understand the development towards present-day situations and conflicts in urban settings where they correlate with national and transnational events or trends. My book, in general terms, so beyond Istanbul, adding also to larger literatures, counters conceptions of the dilapidation and loss of functions of historic urban centers after the Second World War, which we see in narrations of London, which we see in narrations of Berlin, of Amsterdam, of Brussels, but also very much, of course, in Istanbul. What the case of Beyoğlu demonstrates, and it connects to many of the urban centers in Europe and elsewhere, is that the area was next to decline, primarily caused, in the case of Beyoğlu, by the forced departure of significant portions of its residents, subject to a significant deal of continuity of its functions, educational as places of social gathering, as a place of social gathering. And as I noted previously, this also had a catalyzing effect, you could argue, on existing representations. So this idea of decay, which I tried to counter, had a catalyzing effect on existing representations of Beyoğlu as a place of squalor, of moral decay, of vulgarity, and essentially a Janus-faced district, a space for business. It was actually a space for business, education, and culture during daytime, and of nightlife, and yes, also somewhat shady nightlife at night. Now, identifying, analyzing, and critically commenting on these representations, their origins, and correlation with historical developments retains its relevance in the Beyoğlu of today as well. Similar to other metropoles in which historical landscapes and rapid urban transformation come together, historical Istanbul and Beyoğlu are highly complex and palimpsestic historical landscapes. And as such, any major interventions to their landscape must try to negotiate these historical complexities, layers, and associations, which I think you also try to do at a broad level at the Levantine Heritage Foundation. Now, this pertains equally to the layers of the first decades of the Turkish Republic and before, as it does to the periods between the 1950s and the 1990s. And therefore, I think that my book, my research, is also a critical call to reject the dismissal of the right to placemaking and trying to break with the representations of the area through a lens of overdetermined nostalgia. I think that's about it. Close to an hour. I hope I have not made you tired too much. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look very much forward to discussing any questions you might have. Also, if you would like to share information or material from this period or know anyone who might, I would also be very happy to hear about that. Thank you very much.
Okay, Enno, thank you very much indeed for that talk and for those particular case studies of great interest. If you'd like to stop sharing, we'll move to discussions. If you have a comment or question, you can wave your hand or use the Zoom raised hand function, or just post something in the chat. Would anyone like to say something on this? If not, let me lead off with something. It's interesting, over the years, have there been any attempts by, let's say, non-governmental organizations to promote the preservation of, let's say, the architectural components of the Beyoğlu culture? Or is that something, am I really looking at it from a very much a Western European and even British perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much for the question, Quentin. Yes, I do think that there are, various ad or grassroots initiatives that try to preserve, the heritage of Beyoğlu. So one of the most notable ones, and maybe also maybe slightly contestable ones, was the Beyoğlu Güzelleştirme Derneği. So the Association for the Beautification of Beyoğlu, a slightly more, if I may say so, critical association was a similarly named grassroots initiative in Cihangir. So one of the neighborhoods in Beyoğlu. But we also see, of course, initiatives of NGOs that take issue with particular communal heritage, like Turan Dink Vakfı or also Tarih Vakfı, possibly also to some extent the LHF, who try to create awareness about the significance of preservation of architectural heritage in Beyoğlu. Sometimes also I could not mention that here in the in the talk, but we also see that it comes from some of the associations and schools itself. So one of the clubs that I studied was a German club, the Teutonia. And you might say that Teutonia as a club where people would actually, gather in a more or less or greater or lesser lively setting, would basically cease to exist, especially after the 1980s. But from then onwards, the caretakership of the board of the the club actually becomes one of its most important rationales of the endurance of the club. So Teutonia, we might say, still exists today because it actually owned the property in Galip Dede Caddesi. So now it has been recently renovated, and I believe that the Orient Institute will move very soon. So sometimes, like there are also sort of initiatives that come directly from the owners of the buildings towards preservation. You see, to some degree, maybe also something in the not exactly counterpart, but we could somehow call it a counterpart of the Teutonia in the Italian context. So that's the Società Operaia, which also in cooperation with other actors, as a few years ago, completed the renovation of their building, so of the Società Operaia building, which is in one of the side streets of Istiklal Caddesi. So we do see that both on the NGO level, as on the grassroots level, as on the owners level, that are just to preserve some of the heritage of Beyoğlu. Yeah.
But the influence is probably more if you own the building or you're connected, let's say, to a foreign national government, that you arguably have more security or more hope of maintaining that presence and the culture that comes from it.
Yeah, that is indeed. That is actually an interesting point that you raised there, because actually in 1979, Teutonia, for instance, almost lost it because it's, like one of the formal stipulations, and I believe maybe still, of association in Turkey is that they need to have these annual meetings. Otherwise, they will be taken out of the national registry, and that means that they will also lose their properties, and that properties will be nationalized. And Teutonia also tried to and succeeded in avoiding that risk by making the consulate, so the German consulate, official caretaker, at least on paper, of the building. So another example that runs a little bit counter, actually, sort of this maybe sort of natural reflex of international actors to protect heritage in Beyoğlu is demonstrated by, for instance, the Dutch consulate, but also by the Swedish consulate, which in the post-war period tried to make some efforts. There was also conversation about that actually in the case of the British consulate, to sell off the properties, because they also, had some issues with Beyoğlu, and sort of the size of their buildings. Sometimes it was too big, sometimes it was too old, sometimes the infrastructural layout was too complicated. So to greater or lesser degrees, there were efforts of these consulates also to sell off their properties, which fortunately, I would say, were halted, and then also significant renovation efforts were made to the Palais d'Hollande and the British consulate and the Swedish consulate. Yeah.
Okay. Let me just check if anyone else has a question or a comment. No, well, I've got another following on from that, and it may be an unfair question because it doesn't sort of match your time focus of the sort of 50s to 80s. But when the capital moved to Ankara in the 20s, and the embassies moved, what did that mark the start of the decline of, let's say, that foreign multicultural influence in Istanbul, or was it other factors? The general Turkish, the growth of Turkish state, and that influence.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very interesting question. Well, there's a couple of things. I do not think, like sort of from the perspective of, like sort of international communities of, if you will, of Istanbul, that had a very significant effect, because despite of the fact that Ankara became, formally speaking, the capital of Turkey, the economic and cultural capital would remain Istanbul, as it is basically still today. And that would also mean that the communities who were there for business, commerce, or for culture would stay in Istanbul at the very least until the 1950s. Sort of, like that, more generally, sort of the significance and the appeal of Istanbul gradually starts to degrade a little bit. As for the diplomats, well, some of the diplomatic missions actually expected that the move of the Atatürk regime to make Ankara the capital was actually temporary, and that, like that at some point they would come to their senses and move, like the capital back to Istanbul. And that was, for instance, the case in the case of the Dutch diplomatic mission. They actually decided to sort of, like keep their main representation for a significant amount of time in Istanbul because of this reason. So they expected, while at some point they'll come back to Istanbul and, like leave this silly Anatolian city behind again. Well, that obviously didn't happen, and that also meant, for instance, in the case of the Netherlands, that for a long time they were positioned in a somewhat more secondary secondary status neighborhood in Ankara, rather than, like some of the early adopters took, like prime spots in the city. So so long answer, but as a short answer, so the 1920s and sort of, like this shift from the capital did not necessarily have, like a very strong impact on the demography of Istanbul, apart from some of the people who decided, like to leave the city either forcibly or on of their own decision. Yeah.
Last question from me. I mean, if you look forward, should we be hopeful that some of the good side of these cultural artifacts, should we be optimistic that they will continue and have a benefit, have an impact both for Turkey and for the other communities in the area?
I hope that we can be hopeful, but a lot, like also depends sort of, like on the political climate in the country, because that will also determine sort of the more general attitude towards, like the construction sector, for instance, and sort of towards the preservation of heritage. And so Beyoğlu has often been represented sort of as the other, as I also try to show with Asian, and that is also a sort of, like a representation that troubles, like this issue of heritage preservation, where we see, like a very strong cultivation of heritage preservation in the historic peninsula, which is also actually in many ways contestable. For a long time, we have not seen that in Beyoğlu, which actually also in the 1980s, for instance, many of you will be familiar with Tarlabaşı Boulevard. So the sort of the motorway that crosses right through Beyoğlu on its western side. That is an effect, sort of this attitude towards, like quote unquote heritage that has had a, like a significant impact on the makeup or the architectural makeup of the district. And I think, like there are some hopeful currents, like in Beyoğlu. So we see that, for instance, the mayorship of Ekrem İmamoğlu has brought at least, like a a more attentive, like ear to, like the voices of experts. So we do see that, like greater care is, like invested in preserving of historic heritage. But still, we are, of course, also confronted with a very big private sector which owns a lot of the properties also in Beyoğlu, and is in part also responsible for what we can see nowadays in Beyoğlu. So is it more like small shops, like small bars? Is it like a vibrant creational nightlife, or is it like the sort of the mainstream shopping bonanza that we see now, actually also in Istiklal and in Amsterdam, in London, or wherever? So the Mango, Zara's, and like the big hotel chains. So a lot will also depend in the future on the desire and the ability of the government to sort of like push back, and also, of course, hopefully of civil society, to push back against real estate speculation, because that is one of the main problems of Beyoğlu since approximately the 1990s, but certainly since the 2000s. So real estate values are being pumped up, and like you need to put in like sort of the highest bidder into the place, or maybe destroy the place altogether if that's will bring you more profit. So let's hope we can be hopeful, but yeah, unfortunately it's still a little bit diffuse, this future. Yeah.
Well, I'm generally an optimistic and hopeful person, and I hope the Levantine Heritage Foundation and our colleagues in Istanbul, the Levanten Kültur Mirası'nı Koruma, will help build that momentum and the relationship with the municipality, which I think we've had positive connections with them in the past, and let's hope that these things develop and assist. Unless anyone else would like to comment or raise a question, I'm going to bring this to a close. I don't see anybody. So Enno, thank you very much for your presentation. Really appreciate you sharing that with us. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, this morning, wherever you may be. And I look forward to seeing you all again at our next event on the 13th of June. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.